Hello, everybody. I am Dian Griesel. I'm also known as Silver Disobedience. This is the Silver Disobedience Perception Dynamics podcast. And I am super excited. Today, we're going to get some really good info from Willie Pietersen, who is the former CEO of Lever Brothers, Seagram's, Tropicana, a lot of different companies. He's worked in various different levels and really made it to the top. And now he's taken his insights and put them into a book, Leadership, the Inside Story, which is going to be time-tested prescriptions for those who want to lead. I think it's seek to lead, but it's the New York thing squeezing in there. We're going to be talking about asking the wrong questions, self-sabotage in underestimating nonverbal communication, which I talk about a lot, earning trusts, benefits of taking a walk, many of my all-time favorite topics. So, Willie, I am truly honored. Thank you for giving me your time.
Pleasure for me to be with you. Thank you.
I tell you, can we just start with, how do you get to be the CEO of conglomerates? Feel free with starting wherever you want. I admire that. That's big.
Yeah, I don't think there's a magic bullet, Diane. I think the essence is to have a real drive and passion for what you do, to feel that it's a good fit with who you are and what drives you, or what gives you fulfillment. And, as you progress through an organization, you're tested all the time by those who have to appoint you to the next level. You test yourself all the time. You examine yourself. And I think the key is to be honest about, am I personally, do I feel fit for this next level? And then to be honest about it, because otherwise you're going to drown. People who get promoted beyond their competency get into real trouble. So I think there's a lot of self-knowledge involved in it. I think the essence of good leadership is authenticity at the end of the day, being grounded in a clear and sound set of values that guide your actions and inspire others. And that's what Marcus Aurelius, the Roman philosopher and emperor, called your own internal command center. So I felt I was driven forward by those beliefs and those principles. I derived great joy from bringing out the best in others. I'm a lifelong learner, so I enjoyed learning about the next level and getting myself up to speed on doing it well. And I was always looking for feedback that helped me better. So that's just my own personal recipe. I like what Voltaire said in his book Candide. Everyone must cultivate their own garden. So you all have ways of moving forward in life and determining what's best for you and what you can excel at. But that was my story.
Well, I would love you to go back to your first few jobs, and then we can segue into conglomerate. Somebody gets a break somewhere. Somebody starts to know they like what they are doing. Tell us about your first jobs and what you learned in them.
Well, my first job was practicing law. And I practiced law in South Africa for 5 years before I became a corporate executive. I enjoyed law. I enjoyed the rigor. I enjoyed the pursuit of logic, the objective thinking, critical thinking, reasoning, etc. I was a litigation lawyer, so I enjoyed being on my toes and dealing with emerging situations and coping with them. But law is also confining in many ways. The other element about practicing law in South Africa is that I had a drive, an ambition to have an international career. And, if you practice law, you're confined by the jurisdiction that you're practicing in. You're not qualified to practice worldwide. And so that was, for me, a little bit confining. Now, let me just take you right back to my childhood here.
Yeah, I would love to. I like to know where people started.
Yeah, because
Because everyone thinks everyone's an overnight rock star, that you came out of your mother's womb as the CEO of a mega conglomerate. Nobody
exactly.
wants to believe there was a pathway these days.
Oh, Mom, I'm going to be a CEO. Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, I was, as I mentioned, I was born and raised in South Africa. We lived in a smallish town called East London on the coastline. And of course, South Africa is on the southern tip of Africa,
Mhm.
a very remote place in that kind of way. East London was a smallish town situated on this southern tip of Africa on the coastline. And I had a large map of the world on the wall facing my bed. And I was intrigued by this world map and looking at the various countries of the world. And in the mornings, the sun would rise through, from the east through my bedroom window and shine on this map. It was almost like putting a spotlight as a reminder. Here you are in this little place, and here's the big wide world. I put a pin into where I was living in East London at the southern tip of Africa, as a reminder that there I was, just as a little pin in a remote place, without any kind of experience of what the whole wide world had to offer. And I developed a kind of a yearning, even at the age of 10, maybe even slightly earlier, to say, I want to experience the whole world, or as much of it as I can. Different places, different cultures, different ways of living, different perceptions of life. I only have one shot. I have one life. I don't know how long I'm going to live, but I want to have that broad experience. So that urge expressed itself while I was practicing law, combined with one other factor. I was living in South Africa during the era of apartheid.
Mhm.
I've heard of apartheid. It's pronounced in Afrikaans apartheid, and that kind of sums up in many ways what it was. It was a legally enforced system of racial segregation and oppression. It was illegal for the races to live, different races to live in the same areas, go to the same schools, go to the same hospitals, to marry, to have sexual relationships across the color bar was illegal. I encountered some cases defending people who had been separated by these harsh laws, family just fragmented, kids told to go to different schools because the shade of their skin was slightly different. This became intolerable to me and my family, and we determined that we did not want to raise a family in South Africa. So now you combine these factors of this yearning to have a worldwide career, the feeling that I really, or we, my wife and I, are determined it was intolerable to continue to live in a system like that. And we said, well, what's our exit route? And I said, well, I can't just jump out of here and go and practice law in America, for example. I'm only qualified to practice law here. And I also have a law degree in the UK because I went to Oxford to study law as well. But I said, I think if I join an international corporation, I might have an opportunity for an international career. So now you've got a confluence of two things: this yearning to have a worldwide experience, together with wanting to get out of South Africa. And I eventually joined Unilever and was very fortunate because through Unilever, I had an international career. I was posted to different countries, became the CEO of subsidiary companies within Unilever, and then subsequently in other companies, as you mentioned before. So I've given you a bit of a long answer to, why are these shifts happening? And, we are products of our history, our upbringing. And that's why I went right back to the pin in the map. I often think about still. And it's kind of, that's really part of my philosophy even now, as being a lifelong learner. There was a famous judge on the Supreme Court. I forget his name for the moment, but he retired eventually. Oliver Wendell Holmes was his name. And he retired, and FDR apparently went to visit him one day in his retirement. At that stage, Wendell Holmes was 91 years old. And FDR found him sitting in an armchair studying Plato.
I love it.
And the FDR said to him, what are you doing? And he said, I'm improving my mind. Lifelong learning.
I love that trait, and I'm always very grateful to my mother and father. But my mother in particular lived to 92, and she was sitting reading until 48 hours before she died. Know thyself.
Yes.
I'm like, Mom, I just love it.
Exactly. We learn our way to success. It's not bestowed on us. It doesn't drop out of the blue sky. We learn our way there. I think that's the nature of progress, personal progress, and progress within any system.
And you have a new book that we could be learning from. You've taken all these wise nuggets that you have and somehow gathered them together. I'm not sure how, into a book smaller than War and Peace, but I gather you did that.
Well, I keep
and the print's a little bigger than Atlas Shrugged, so I'm impressed.
Yeah, well, I demanded. I said to my publisher, I need people to be able to read it easily, and I want a short book. I don't want a long, meandering book. So my first draft, he took a look at it and he said, "You're being a little bit blunt in your book." I said, "Well, I want to draw crisp conclusions and not embroider them too much." He said, "No, you've got to give it a bit of room to breathe." Which I remember that phrase. So I went back and gave it a bit of breathing, elaborated slightly, but I still wanted to write a short book that was easy to consume with these thoughts. Now, I keep a learning journal. You asked about, how do I pull all these ideas together? And I've kept a learning journal since I was 16 years old. Now, there's a backstory there. I went to an all-boys school in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And it was that stage, all white as well. Blacks, whites couldn't go to the same schools at those days. It was a splendid school, actually, called Selborne College. And they built character and valued education as well. I had an English teacher called Mr. Pietersen. And on one occasion, he was promoting a discussion, I think, on Shakespeare or something, and listening to our answers. And then he stopped and he said, "I'm struck by something." He said, "Here you are, 16-year-olds, with a very limited vocabulary. Mm-hmm. All you can really, master in terms of, what you talk about is fast cars, sport, and girls. So I want you to expand your vocabulary." He said, "Tomorrow I'm going to hand out a little notebook." He arrived the next day, handed out a little notebook to each of us. There were about 30 of us in the class. And he said, "Here's your task. Every morning, have a look at the local newspaper, find a word that you didn't know the meaning of. Write down that word plus the meaning and bring it to class. I'll do cold calling." And he'd call, somebody, "Sam, what's your word?" And Sam would say, "Ecstasy," or something. Mm-hmm. Well, who didn't know? You didn't write it down. So I got this, I still have my notes from that. But out of that grew, when I learned something in astronomy class, I wrote it down in that same little book. Botany.
I love this.
And then eventually it flourished into, my great reading pursuits in philosophy, evolutionary science, astrophysics, etc., which are my reading hobbies. Mm-hmm. Some business books. I captured it all in my learning journal. So when I started to write my book, the first thing I did was, and now with a pile of these learning journals, I spent about a week just going through them from the beginning, right through, that thread of learning to the present time, and said, well, here are the key things I'd like to impart in my book.
Wow. That is such a great suggestion for anyone to adapt at any point. I mean, I'm a notebook person and I do write my ideas in it, but the idea of adding a word or something, something along those lines, that's a really good idea.
I've got a role model I admire. Mm-hmm. I became friends with a very renowned surgeon in New York called Ash Tawari. He was a pioneer of robotic surgery, very precise surgery, etc. And I took groups of executives to visit with him because he was a scientific pioneer and a leader of people he was remarkable. And, he, at the beginning of his little talk always, and then we'd have a Q&A, he would say to the people I brought along, executives from various companies, he'd say to them, do you keep a learning journal? And some did, and said, tell me about it. Why do you value it? Why do you keep it? Tell other people in this room why you think it's a good idea. He said, well, I keep it religiously. And he says, Willie over here, who I know because we've talked to each other, he keeps one as well. And he went on about it. At a certain point, he said to me, let's have dinner together. I want you to bring your learning journal, and I'll bring mine along. And we'll
that's a personal question.
Yes. Well, he's a guy from India, and India's got a great intellectual tradition, as you might know. So we sat down to dinner, and I glanced across the table, and I saw this leather-bound thing, and I said, what's that? He said, that's my learning journal. I said, there's a leather cover. He said, yes, it's very precious. I said, oh, okay. Well, mine was just a normal one with a hard cover. And he paged through it, and it was all in ink. I said, Ash, I can't write in ink. I make mistakes. He said, no, think clearly first, then write in ink. Then I noticed something else. Above every insight was the question that insight was responding to. And he said, the important thing is to understand the question you're trying to answer. Now, I'd never thought of that before. And the other thing, he was very good at drawing pictures. I'm no good at that, but, so I didn't try. But he had little graphics, little pictures that illustrated something, a bee flying towards a flower for its pollen to illustrate a point about, transmitting knowledge and all that sort of stuff. And I said, I don't think I'm going to show you mine because it just doesn't compare. But leather bound, written in ink, and this wonderful practice of saying answers without good questions in front of them are not really complete insights. Well, lovely idea there.
That's, oh my gosh, I have two thoughts. One is that's one of the things you wrote about your book, asking the wrong question. So I want to address that. But it's so funny that someone would ask to borrow your book because I've been a lifelong reader. We weren't allowed to watch television growing up in our house. And there was no television. So if we had to watch it at a friend's.
Yes.
But I have probably about 3,000 books, and they're very important to me. I bought them at yard sales. Anywhere I go, if I find a book I want to read, I have old editions, new editions.
Yes.
But I've marked them all up with yellow markers or Post-it notes or folded pages. So when someone's looking at my books and they say, oh, can I just borrow that? I'm like, no, I'll have it to you from Amazon tomorrow because I don't want anyone to see all the things I highlighted.
Exactly.
It's too personal.
Yeah.
You'd know I was a head case.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, absolutely. I have a lot of books. I'm never done in Florida at my winter base. So you can't see my bookcase, which is above me. Yeah. In my New York office, I've got hundreds of books in bookcases. And I often hold meetings there. And one time somebody stopped and said, have you read all those books? I said, no. I skimmed a number of them. And a few of them, the real gems, I read deeply and sometimes reread. And he looked and he said, yeah, I can see all those little stickers in them, just like you. Yeah.
Like I mentioned, I happen to really like the book Atlas Shrugged. I was thrilled when it finally came out in the large print edition. It's only about this thick and weighs about 5 pounds. So your arms get tired reading it, but at least my eyes can handle it.
Right.
I want to go back. You talked about the importance of the wrong question. Asking the wrong question and how that can impact you. How does somebody know if they're asking the right question or the wrong question?
The starting point here is to realize that everything we know in life, whether it's scientific or general knowledge, comes from a question somebody answered. Einstein, who came up with E equals mc squared, didn't sit playing his violin one day and it dropped out of the blue sky and into his head. He discovered that, and he developed that formula, the special theory, followed by the general theory and it came from a set of questions he asked. The same thing was true of Charles Darwin when he went on this tour of the Beagle, and he was away about 6 years or something. I've got his questions that he asked at the start, and that led to his majestic book, Origin of Species. It came from a set of questions. So we really have to understand that our portals of discovery, as James Joyce called them, are questions. And to make great decisions and to really penetrate an issue and understand its core and develop a point of view about what to do, you have to have the right questions. I think a great competency for leaders is this ability to ask the right questions. Now, let's think about the right questions for a minute. I used to practice law, as I told you. And, cross-examinations in a court case involve a set of questions for a witness. And those questions are used as weapons. They're designed to expose inconsistencies and falsehoods, et cetera, or gaps in memory. And somebody's on the defensive. Learning questions are the opposite of those kinds of weapons, weapons. They are invitations to learn. Now, let's just think of an example.
That's very well said.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Think of an example. Let's say you're on the executive committee and somebody brings in a proposal for an investment, and there's some gaps. Now, one thing you could do in posing a question is to ask a question is to say, well, tell me, why didn't you look at this? And where is the evidence about that? Now, you're putting somebody on trial. You're putting them on the defensive. And they're not going to give you a good answer. They're going to turn around and kind of defend themselves. A better way to approach it is to ask not a you question, but a we question, to make it a joint venture of learning. What more should we look at in order to get a better understanding of this issue? Let me know what you think. What more do you think we might look at here? What about this? What about that? And now you're working together to explore an issue more deeply. So the way you ask a question, and open-ended questions are better than a closed-ended question. Closed-ended question, will this work? Well, what's the person say? If they're in love with a proposal, they say, well, I can't give a guarantee because there are risks involved, but I hope it will. Instead, say, we have to incur risk when we make bold decisions. Give me a percentage of what you think that this might work, so we can think about elevating that percentage a little bit through further exploration. Now, again, it's kind of an open-ended question, not yes or no, but probability. I've got an example of it's a rather stunning example of asking the wrong question, which takes you to a bad place, and then of discovering the right question ultimately. And it's a question that comes from the American Revolutionary War. And in the 18th century, as you know, for your international listeners, apologies, it's about American history here, but very briefly, there were 13 independent colonies in the US at that point, all colonies of the UK, but living independently of each other. And they banded together, Declaration of Independence, decided to fight a war of independence against the British occupiers. And they'd never formed a joint army before. They didn't even have the same uniforms. They never trained together. And George Washington was put in charge of this endeavor. And not surprisingly, in the early stages of this war of independence, which was actually a rebellion, they were on the back foot. They were losing rather badly. And it was discouraging. And the story goes, and this comes from journals that people kept. David McCullough, the great historian, is no longer alive, wrote about this. And George Washington collected his senior officers around the campfire and said, well, as you all know, we're not doing well. And if we don't change our way here, we stand to lose. And then, of course, we're all rebels and we'll all go to the gallows for treason. So losing is not a good idea. And he said, well, now let's really think this through. How can we defeat the British? We have to find a way. And the discussion ensued, and people, offered all kinds of different proposals and remedies and alternatives, and none of them proved practical. They were really up against the most formidable military at that time in the world. The strongest army, the strongest navy that ruled the waves, et cetera, et cetera. The British Army was right at the top, and here was this rebel group trying to fight them. And it went on and on. It was very discouraging, but it involved intense mental engagement. Mm-hmm. Unlocked all kinds of creative juices because it was a pursuit of, finding a way. And apparently, eventually, one of the senior officers said, may I speak? I think we're asking the wrong question. What we've demonstrated is there's no good answer to that question. Let's not keep hammering away at a question where there's no good answer. I think the right question is, how can we avoid losing? That, by the way, is the question that won a war, because it gave birth to a new method of commando raids, which was a novelty at the time because there were all these kind of fixed form, clashes between armies. Mm-hmm. Rapid raids against the British columns, taking them by surprise, rapid withdrawals before taking losses. And the theory was that eventually they would exhaust the British, who would then go home. And it worked with the help of the French in the final push. But it worked. Now, that whole approach, that whole strategy came from a question somebody asked. Mm-hmm. If they had that question, and who knows how the whole thing would have turned out. So there we are. That was an example of asking the wrong question and then eventually arriving at the right question that unlocked a terrific solution.
That is a great story, and it brings me to my next question. Something you talk about in your book is earning trust. I mean, Clearly, George Washington and the other leaders at that time had to do an awful lot to gain trust. What would you say you would impart to leaders about the importance of that and how to do it?
Yeah, trust has a set of foundations. You can't just say to people, as you sometimes hear, trust me. Why? Give me a reason. Give me some confidence that I should. So I think there's certain building blocks in any setting that you're operating in that involves other human beings, where you need to encourage them to work together, to do heroic things. And the first requirement, of course, in the military is never ask your army to do things that you yourself were not prepared to do. And I think that applies generally in life. Go and do this, go and do that. I'm above it. I don't get involved in that kind of thing. That's demeaning, obviously. Mm-hmm. But, the building blocks I think of when I think about trust in human relationships, in professional relationships as well, in business, is that there's certain building blocks. Building block number one is I understand your needs. If people feel that you don't truly understand their needs, their underlying needs and motivations, they will doubt you. They won't trust you. They think, well, no, you've got some ulterior motives here. You don't really understand me. You've got your own personal motives in mind. Understand your needs. And the second question then you have to answer based on that, once you've satisfied them, that, yeah, I do understand what you need, the problem you're wrestling with, and the solution you're looking for. Mm-hmm. Second then is, I have the skills to solve your problem. It's like going to a surgeon and, you say, well, okay, I need this kind of neurosurgery or something like that. And it's clear that I need it. And you say, oh, you understand my needs here. You've done an X-ray, you've done a scan, you understand it. Well, how many of these have you done? And he says, I've done 2. And then you say, wow, what happened? One died and the other one is in a coma. Okay, you don't have the skills to solve my problem. I think I'll go elsewhere. So that's the second, a really important one. The third one is, I care about your success.
Mm-hmm.
I have your interests in mind. I'll go the extra mile. Based on these first two things, I have to show that I truly care about your success, not just in a superficial, mechanical way, but in my actions that I demonstrate to you, that I act on those instincts.
Mm-hmm.
Fourth one is I keep my promises. And therein lies consistency. In small things and large, it's an interesting thing. But if you're developing a relationship with people and want to demonstrate that you keep your promises, and there's a lunch or something, and you arrive late a few times, and people begin to say, well, if you don't keep your promises in small things, how can I feel confident you'll keep them in larger issues where the stakes are high? Just keep your promises and be consistent. And the final one is, I'm a truth teller. I will always tell you the unvarnished truth, even though it might not be pleasant for me. I'm not just a good news person. I'll give you all the truth, because if I withhold the truth from you, that disadvantages you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I tell you a really rather moving story about being a truth teller that, again, I vividly remember, a very personal story in many ways. My father died at the age of 61, rather prematurely and unexpectedly. And it turns out it was a medical mistake. Now, how do I know this? Well, he died from an aneurysm that should have been detected from the symptoms he was displaying, but it wasn't detected, and the aneurysm burst, and he just died suddenly. The day after he died, our doctor, Dr. Goldswain, this is still living in South Africa, in East London in South Africa, came to visit. And sitting in our living room was me, my sister, and my stepmother. He'd just recently remarried. And Dr. Goldswain said, well, we'd known him for years.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I'm so sorry for your loss, etc. He said, your father shouldn't have died. It was a mistake. And it was I who made the mistake. And I've come here to tell you that I made the mistake, and that I'm terribly sorry for what happened.
Ooh.
I was stunned by that. My sister got up and hugged him.
Yeah, that's an emotional moment. And I didn't know your father. Wow.
So,
that's a big, bold move.
We always
it's
talk
honorable.
Yeah, the honorable thing to do, the truth, the humility, the humanity that he displayed. Did we trust him afterwards? Yes, with
I bet you did.
My nose. I went to Dr. Goldswain because I trusted him to tell me the truth. So, that was kind of, for me, a real lesson in that kind of integrity.
That's an integrity lesson at the highest level.
Indeed.
One of the things you said, as I'm getting a little, teary, hearing that story, it happens sometimes during these interviews. I don't know why. But let's talk about nonverbal communication. What a segue.
Right, exactly. You're just demonstrating it now. I love it. Your feelings are so spontaneous. Man, I do.
I love deep stories about humanity. That's why I love doing these interviews. I've been in business for 30 years, not quite as long as you, but, dealt with all kinds of people. And I wish I started to do these years ago, because it's not often in life you get to just ask someone questions for an hour that I wouldn't have known you otherwise. And I already feel like you're just someone I love and admire. So it's a wonderful feeling.
Yeah, it's a way to connect, isn't it? To really learn,
it's wonderful.
Share perspectives. That's the way we connect at a human level, which is great.
So tell me about self-sabotaging that people do by underestimating that nonverbal communication.
The interesting thing about that is that as leaders, whether we're, I always think about leadership as leading from the middle. It's not just leadership from the top. Everything you do at any level in an organization, you're displaying leadership. Everything you do in your family as a parent, Leadership has various settings. We think
Mm-hmm.
about natural leadership, which are the politicians, military leadership, the generals, organizational leadership, the CEOs, etc. And then and then there's community service, and
Mm-hmm.
then within our families, whether we're looking after an elder member of the family or looking after our kids or siblings or whatever it is, we're always making a difference in some way to people's lives. That's leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing to understand, I think, is that everything you do is symbolic. And we need to be aware of the symbolism, the fallout, if you like, of our actions. If you walk into the office as a CEO, it just tends to be true that everybody's watching you.
Mm-hmm.
And if you walk in with all hunched over and looking depressed, maybe you've got a pain or you've just had a nasty discussion with somebody beforehand that's upset you. That infects the mood. You go in with a spring in your step and say hi, and with a smile on your face, that infects people as well. So I think symbolic fallout is a very important thing. I'll give you an example of it.
I love that expression, symbolic fallout.
Symbolic fallout. I borrowed that from
That's a good one. I had never heard that.
from a colleague who used that, and I hadn't thought about capturing it in that particular phrase, but that's what it is.
It's very vivid.
Yes, it's vivid. It kind of gets one's attention, right?
Mm-hmm.
Simplicity is attention getting, isn't it? I was doing some consulting with a family company in South Africa, a liquor company called Snell and Company. And I'd known the founders, who became personal friends of mine, etc. The next generation down, a young man called Ian Hooper. And I was, over the years, was doing consulting work with them. And I went to their offices in Cape Town, and we had a number of meetings set up. One with the marketing group, another one with the operations group, and onwards. And so we had to move from one conference room to another. And we need to keep the time because otherwise you'd kind of lose control and you'd sit there at 8 o'clock at night, right? So we moved from one place to another, and I noticed something along the way. Is, of course, you meet traffic, human traffic coming the other way, And Ian, he could have just said, hi, Bob, hi, Mary, and marched onwards, which would have been my way, I guess. I'm going somewhere. I've got to be somewhere at a certain time. Hi, I'm on my way. He stopped briefly each time and said, hi, Fred, good to see you. Thanks for that job you did so promptly the other day. How did your son do in the recent rugby game? Super. Good. Congratulations. Then on he went, and he did this with everybody. And I thought, you're wasting time. Well, he wasn't wasting time. He was lifting people up and making them feel important. I've got a little thing. It's in my learning journal that I wrote down what somebody once said about leadership. He said, you've got to know or pretend in your mind, you could imagine that everybody in your company is wearing a big sign on their chest that says, make me feel important. Now, that's what Ian was. Now, it wasn't the conversation that mattered. It's the fact that he was giving these people some of his time. Now, that's what life consists of, is chunks of time. And when life is over, it's there.
Time's over.
Run out of time. So this is a very important kind of act of symbolism again. And there are many other examples of this, of body language. I mentioned in my book having to hire somebody for a key job, financial analysis, of the two candidates, both female, highly qualified. It was kind of one of these things you can't go wrong. You could hire either one of them and they would flourish. They were extremely capable. But I had to make a choice. And I interviewed the first one, and again, very impressive. Interviewed the second one, equally impressive, different personalities, etc. And my assistant, Joanne, after the first round of interviews said, well, who have you picked? I said, well, I don't know. I can't make up my mind. Let's arrange a second meeting. And this time I thought of a different question to ask.
Mm-hmm.
And this time I said to the first one, why do you want to have this job? And she
Mm-hmm.
folded her arms and gave me a wonderful answer. Very cerebral, very full of commitment, that she cared a lot about it. She felt she was good at it. She felt she could make a contribution. She understood our priorities. And I thought, wow, I couldn't give a better answer than that. I asked the same question of the second one. Let's call the second one Mary. I said, Mary, why do you want this job? She leaned forward and gave me a similarly scintillating answer. And mentally, I thought to myself, you're hired. Joanne said to me, well, what do you think? And I said, it's Mary. And write her a note. She said, why Mary? I said, because she sat forward. And then Joanne looked at me. She said, oh, I get it. I said, attitude. And it was demonstrated through body language. That's a completely true story. I remember it baffled Joanne. She used to joke afterwards when I had to interview somebody from the outside for the job. Did they sit forward?
But it's such an interesting thing to observe. I'm a body language studier,
Yes.
and it's everything. It's, does the person smell? Do they smell like they're sweating? Are they smiling? Is it a relaxed smile? Can they keep any kind of eye contact?
Correct.
Are they leaning forward? Do I feel like you're getting an embrace without getting an embrace in the conversation, where it feels like things are going back and forth? I
Right.
think there's a lot to it.
Oh, of course,
Those
absolutely.
intangibles.
Ralph Waldo Emerson, I'm full of quotes because I'm interested.
I love them. My kids tell me I torture them with those.
Yeah, well, that's my comfort now again. Just, there you go again. I say, well, okay, here I go again. But Emerson captured it so beautifully when he said, what you do speaks so loudly that I cannot hear what you say. And I think that's true.
That I've heard that one, and it's so good.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Lovely, nice summation.
Before we summarize this, because I know we're on a tight time frame, and seriously, Willie, I could talk to you for another 6 hours, if time permitted. I'm enjoying this so tremendously. One of the things you mentioned is taking a walk. Walking is my favorite form of exercise. So I want to know how walks, from your perspective, are helpful to leaders.
Yeah, here it's really coming across something that is profoundly important, actually. We have to find ways in our busy lives to get away from the urgent and think about the important. We have to carve out ways to do that. Now, I discovered
that's a really good line, to think about the urgent
and think about the important.
The important,
yes. Doing everything without thought. So, you could do them. People meditate, do various practices. I am a walker like you. I've had my morning walk this morning and thought about things that were kind of on my mind, at the back of my mind. And I developed a habit. Corporate executive. I worked in Manhattan and I commuted from Connecticut. And those days as a CEO, I was spoiled. I had a driver and Joe. And I said, he always dropped me on the west side of of Central Park. And I would walk across the park in a diagonal way to the east side, where he picked me up again. A 20-minute walk. I knew I could do a mile in 10 minutes. I knew I was walking 2 miles a day, and I did it every day. Joe was
I love that.
Yeah, Joe was
wow.
bit of a nanny. And he'd say, oh, it's very windy today, Mr. Oh, today it's this and that. It's cold. I said, Joe, the only weather I don't walk in is rain. If snow, everything else that keeps me dry, it's okay. I've got to walk every day. But I discovered something. I discovered that what flew into my mind uninvited during walks like this was new, fresh ideas, fresh perspectives on a problem I'd been grappling with my team. Maybe it was a negotiation for a joint venture and we were trying to break through a log jam, and suddenly an idea would come into my head. Now, I didn't start with an agenda when I started to walk. Sometimes I started with an agenda that vanished in 5 minutes. I might maybe have to make a speech at the end of the day because somebody was retiring. And I'd say to myself, well, I'll think about that during the walk. After about 3 or 4 minutes, that disappeared and another idea would come in. So there was something creative that was happening that I discovered by accident, and it became kind of a religion for me. Whenever I went to a different country, as part of my, portfolio responsibility, I would say to people, we don't begin work while I'm here, whether it's in Thailand or Australia, whatever it is, until I've had my walk. And my walk in Sydney and Australia was always in those wonderful botanical gardens where you got a view of the opera house and so on. That was very inspiring. And then often in the office afterwards, if I would come up with a fresh idea, people would say, I see you had your walk this morning. Now, I then, let me look into this. What's happening? Is this idiosyncratic? Is this just me? Is this a kind of a unique experience? And I found it's completely not that. And I cite in my book these numerous examples of great breakthroughs in thinking that came during a walk. I give you just one. Nikola Tesla was a brilliant engineer. Edison had, if you like, discovered electricity, but it was what's called direct current. And that required numerous substations because it couldn't travel very far from its initial impetus. So it had limitations. And Tesla was wrestling with doing something called alternating current that would travel further, but he couldn't find the technique to make that work. And he battled on in his laboratory, and people thought he was batty. They thought he was a little bit, off on the other end, if you like. And he eventually gave up. He said, well, there clearly is no answer. And he went back to Budapest in Hungary. And literally it happened that one day he took a walk in a park in Budapest when the answer of solving alternating current flew into his head without him inviting it in. And what we now have is Nikola Tesla's solution to the efficient generation of electricity. It came from a walk in a park in Budapest. Now, there are numerous other stories of that kind. Mozart, not Mozart, Einstein, I think you've earlier, when he wanted to think deeply, he would often play his violin. Beethoven would take walks in the afternoon with a notepad and a pen. And he would pause every now and again and begin to write the beginning of a symphony. But he did this during a walk. So I looked at the science of it, and there is a scientific reason for it. A release of certain chemicals that activate your neurons and bring you a sense of calm and peace happen when you subtract yourself from busyness and you engage in something aerobic as an addition to it. Then these kind of creative juices are released, through this process, and it's a real scientific process. And so this is not an accident, and it's not idiosyncratic. It's not just about me. It's the way that great creative ideas are unleashed during periods like that. And the underlying idea is that when you're hammering away at a problem and you can't find a solution, don't keep hammering. Withdraw yourself from that situation. Do something different. Go to the theater, read a book, contemplate, have a good conversation with somebody, have lunch with somebody. I promise you, new ideas will emerge. But walking amongst all those alternatives happens for me, and I think for a lot of people, to be the most effective way of releasing new ideas of that kind.
That's one heck of a note to end on. And like I said, I don't want to end, Willie, but I promised I would respect your time. I've been speaking with Willie Pietersen, a top-level executive, a clearly brilliant mind. He's the author of a new book, Leadership, the Inside Time-Tested Prescriptions for Those Who Seek to Lead. And I highly recommend, I know I'm going to be listening to this podcast more than once, and that you share it and listen. Willie, thank you. We're going to move over to the green room. And again, wow, just thank you.
Well, thank you for a wonderful conversation. Very enriching. Great questions. I love your enthusiasm. When I try and answer these questions, you give me a smile and encourage me to go along. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We're moving over to the green room. Bye, everybody. Subscribe.